The prayerful labors of the ministry in their studies, and their faithfulness and zeal in the pulpit, and their sagacity, argument, and eloquence in the assembly, and their writings were all devoted to one great object. The productions of their pens are monuments to this day of their unexampled industry and extensive biblical learning, as well as sound and elevated principles. Their holy lives gave witness to their piety. They were honored of heaven in the success that attended their labors. Religion was in these days felt in the hearts of multitudes. It was cultivated diligently in the closet and the family, and it shone in the life. These years, though few, were years of the right hand of the Most High. An impulse was communicated to the generation, which was not dissipated in the confusions and agitations which soon, alas, soon ensued. Nor was it crushed in the barbarous persecutions which followed, but in spite of one and the other, it wrought for an ungrateful posterity the liberties they continue to enjoy. The infidel and skeptic, the profane and the profligate, the admirers of feudalism and tyranny, may look askance at the honorable mention of this period, but the impartial and faithful pen must record it as the brightest chapter in Scotland's story, presenting to the philosophic student wonderful developments of mind, exhibiting to the politician instructive and impressive lessons, holding forth to the patriot the most commanding examples of wisdom and fortitude and patience and perseverance in rescuing a country from oppression and restoring and establishing its liberties. But above all these, to the Christian, to the lover of the Savior and his church, this period is pregnant with instruction and with promise, the brightest day of Scotland's church, a day in which millennial glory seems to dawn, a church holding directly of her head in heaven with doctrines and institutions and polity based immediately on the Holy Scriptures, with standards so excellent, with ministers so pious and faithful, with a people so enlightened and devoted, allied to a Christian reformed state without any encroachment upon its independence or compromise of her own, with schools for scriptural education and seats of learning consecrated by sound religion and banded together in holy covenant, and standing fast in the liberty wherewith Christ had made her free, and resolutely prosecuting her proper purposes, presents an object commanding admiration. This is the Church of Scotland with which we aspire to the honor of being identified, to which we look back with gratitude and with regrets, remembering from whence we are fallen. Alas, that its prosperous days should be so short, and that while we cast an eye of wonder and delight upon it, clouds and darkness should so soon overshadow it. Number 3. It is a remarkable fact that the Church of God, since its first erection in Eden, has never had a very lengthened period of prosperity. How often do we find her falling from her first love and brought nigh to the point of utter extinction, when God has interposed, declaring that his church is an interest which he will not suffer to decay or to be destroyed. The Second Reformation had scarcely laid down its principles, matured its plans, and commenced its operations when it was arrested in its noble course. Deviations from its wise provisions were introduced, and a variety of causes began insidiously to operate, which issued in its entire subversion at the restoration of the perfidious Charles. The renovation of the National Covenant, the doings of the Assembly at Glasgow, and the Solemn League were considered as unlawful and treasonable, and every principle of the Second Reformation violated. The king was vested with that supremacy which had so long been the bane of the Church's prosperity. This told immediately in the subversion of the Church's independence, in the abolition of presbytery, and the restoration of prelacy and patronage. The authority of the Word of God was set at naught. The nation cast off her obligations to God and his Christ. The public covenants were treated with ignominy and profane contempt, and a barbarous persecution was raised to suppress and extinguish every vestige of the Reformation, and many sealed with their blood their testimony to its great privileges. Thus was the goodly fabric laid in ruin. But we will not despair. Thou shalt arise and have mercy upon Zion, for the time to favor her, yea, the set time is come. For thy servants take pleasure in her stones, and favor the dust thereof. Number 4. The persecution raged for a long period of years, and made havoc of the Church of God. He who rules in the raging sea said, Here shall thy proud waves be stayed. It rolled itself to rest in the memorable Revolution, while much of the divine goodness in behalf of the Church and the nation is to be seen in this event. It is to be deplored that the desolations of Zion were not rebuilt on their ancient foundations. In the views of not a few of the men of that day, the principles of the Second Reformation were not faithfully dealt by at this interesting juncture. Although a long period of alarm and persecution disposed the men of that time to embrace deliverance on easier terms than they would have submitted to in other circumstances, a small minority could not acquiesce in the Revolution. It remained in a state of dissent, refusing to incorporate with the Church or with the state, declining the fellowship of the one and protesting against the other. For a short time the Reverend Messrs. Linning and Boyd and Shields were connected with these persons. They presented a paper in the General Assembly containing the terms on which they and their people would join in communion with them, craving that they might acknowledge breach of covenant, and purge out the ignorant and heterodox and scandalous ministers who had participated in the blood of the saints. But every proposal of this nature was rejected. After unsuccessful efforts to obtain redress, they at last submitted, and the people who had adhered to them were left destitute of a public ministry which they could receive. They formed themselves into fellowship societies, gave publicly to their declinature, instituted a general fellowship, and continued in this way to edify one another and to maintain their attachment to the covenanted Reformation. The Reverend Mr. Macmillan left the established church and acceded to them. So early as 1703, Mr. Macmillan, in conjunction with two other ministers in the Presbytery of Kirkcudbright, gave in a paper craving that effectual measures should be taken for reviving the remembrance of the National Covenant and Solemn League and Covenant, and explicitly asserting the divine right of presbytery, openly avowing Christ's sole headship over the Church, together with her intrinsic liberties, and for stating impartially and mourning over the sins of the land. The two brethren originally associated with him were prevailed upon to withdraw their complaints and submitted to admonition. This Mr. Millen could not do, and he could not be endured. He was libelled, and refusing to comply with the proposal to drop the prosecution of his grievances, he entered his protest, declined the authority of the court, and appealed to the first free and faithful assembly of the Church of Scotland. After the breaking up of the presbytery, and after a number of the members had gone home, the rest repaired to a neighboring church, constituted anew, and rashly and unprecedentedly deposed Mr. Macmillan. His fault was contending for the whole of the covenanted Reformation, although put to the account of irregularities and disorderly courses. I tremble when I think of the readiness with which the Church has proceeded with such censures. Might not ministers, entertaining scruples that could not be said to be altogether groundless, have been allowed to withdraw from communion? But such was not the spirit of the times. Erskine and others, and Gillespie at a future day, received the same treatment. And in times more modern, and by a church whose fathers had received the same treatment, the historian of Knox and Melville, and a few associated with him, were deposed and excommunicated. Mr. Macmillan was prevailed upon to desist from his ministry for a short time, but he never acknowledged the deposition, and when he found that no redress could be had, he resumed his labors with the cordial welcome of his people. He joined the societies in 1706. Along with Mr. John McNeill, preacher, he gave a joint protestation, declinature, and appeal in 1708. He continued to labor till 1753, declaring on his deathbed his adherence to the work of Reformation carried on between 1638 and 1649, testifying, as an authentic narrative declares, against all defections from or opposition to that covenanted cause, or burying it in the rubbish of oblivion, defection, or apostasy, and encroachments on the crown and royal prerogatives of the glorious head of the Church. The Reformed Presbytery was constituted in 1743, and the testimony for the whole of our covenanted Reformation as attained to and established in Britain and Ireland, particularly betwixt the years 1638 and 1649 inclusive, was published in 1761. Number 5. Such is the rise of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. The persons first constituting it regarded themselves as a continuation of the covenanted Church of Scotland, not dissenters from it, but dissenters from what they considered to be defections from it at the Revolution, for they adhered strictly to the principles of the Second Reformation. It may be proper now to state the reasons upon which they acted, and we may keep our eye upon the principles already specified. First, In regard to the headship of Christ, they considered this doctrine unfaithfully dealt with. The resumption of the supremacy over the church was a thing to be expected from the education and character of William, and it was his manifest drift and policy in all his proceedings. The overlooking, at the Revolution, of all that had been done during the Second Reformation in asserting the sole supremacy of Christ was, to our fathers, ominous. The Act 1592, upon which the church was erected at this time, contained no acknowledgment of the headship of Christ. It was passed only a very few years after one of the Black Acts engrossing the supremacy, and contains no repeal of this, but invests the monarch and a portion of this supremacy over assemblies. The revival of this act at the Revolution, in the view of our fathers, placed the vital question of the sole headship of Christ on a most precarious footing. The fact of the settling of the ecclesiastic supremacy in the crown for England and Ireland rendered, in their view, the abolition of it for Scotland a merely nominal political concession of little value, and the more so when they saw this prerogative actually exercised in proroguing and dissolving the assemblies, and sometimes in a very arbitrary manner, and, withal, not only the omission on the part of the Church at the Revolution to condemn the royal supremacy and to assert the sole headship of Christ, but the abrupt dissolution of the assembly when the draft of an act for the purpose of asserting the supremacy of Christ was to be submitted, gave occasion for more than suspicion. These things were before their eyes in all the freshness and recent occurrence, and must have made a more vivid impression than when seen back through a vista of 160 years. Secondly, on the subject of the intrinsic authority and independence of the Church, the minority referred to demurred when they reflected on the manner in which the assembly had been convened by royal authority, not by her own spontaneous call and appointment, on the way in which the confession was enacted by Act of Parliament without consulting the Church, on the omission of the explanatory act with which the assembly of the Second Reformation had received certain portions of the confession, securing the intrinsic right of the Church and her particular polity on the very terms of Act 1592, on the dictatorial manner in which the Church had been addressed by the King on the subject of the admission of ministers and administration of her censures, on the omission of any assertion on the part of the Church of her intrinsic power, and any condemnation of the supremacy on the persons constituting in great proportion the members of the assembly, and on the doubtful abeyance in which the subject of patronage was left. These circumstances were calculated to excite apprehension that the headship, which was nominally abolished, still exercised an authority, and that the Church was not standing in the liberty wherein Christ had made her free.